The shuttle rattled violently as it broke through the dense upper atmosphere of Virelia Ice, its hull groaning like an ancient coffin being pried open. Commissar Runvan sat rigid in his harness, his gloved hands folded over the brass hilt of his power sword. Outside the viewport, a suffocating blanket of grey ash churned in slow, unnatural spirals, obscuring the planet below. It was a world swallowed by silence. No Vox signals, no astropathic messages, nothing but a single phrase endlessly repeated across every frequency they attempted to hail. The throne sleeps. Vaughn could not recall hearing words so profoundly wrong, a blasphemy masquerading as prayer. The sanctity of resolve had been dispatched 3 weeks after contact was lost, its holds filled with a regiment of hardened Imperial Guard veterans, a detachment of Mechanicus tech priests, and one silent inquisitorial representative, whose sealed orders weighed heavier than the ash that veiled the world beneath them. The silence of the interrogator, Malthus, gnawed at Vaughn more than the howling turbulence outside. Missions were dangerous enough when their objectives were clear. This one reeked of shadowed agendas and buried truths. Through the ash clouds, the planetary surface emerged like a corpse revealed beneath a sheet. The primary starport appeared first, a vast complex of gantries and landing bays, all eerily pristine and undamaged, yet utterly deserted. Not a single plume of exhaust rose from its towers. No servitors scuttled along its platform. It was a city of stillness, preserved as if time itself had stopped. The pilots exchanged nervous glances and performed their landing rites twice over, whispering litanies of machine appeasement with trembling lips. When the shuttle's landing struts touched down, there was no echo of metal meeting metal, only a muffled thud as if the planet itself resisted sound. Vaughn's boots sank slightly into the ash as he descended the ramp, his breath catching at the sight before him. The ground was covered in thousands of overlapping footprints, pressed deep into the grey powder. At first glance they seemed to lead in every direction, evidence of a chaotic exodus. Yet as Vaughn followed their trails, his stomach turned. None of the tracks led away. They spiraled inward, converging toward the heart of the landing zone like a vast congregation, and there they simply ended. "Where are the bodies?" muttered Captain Juros beside him, his lasgun sweeping in wide arcs. His question hung in the air unanswered. The air was heavy with a chemical tang, like burnt incense mixed with decay. Vaughn keyed his Vox bead to the command channel, requesting initial reports. The responses came back fragmented, distorted by faint static. Auspex sweeps reported no life signs within several kilometers, though interference grew worse near the starport's central spire. The Mechanicus adepts busied themselves with data probes and sensor arrays, their Binharic chants clicking softly beneath their breath. One of them, a pallid figure with augmetic eyes, tilted his head and reported in a voice flat and mechanical. No decay present in environmental samples, no biomass detected beyond superficial particulate matter, probability of mass population exfiltration negligible. Vaughn's jaw tightened. If the population had not fled and there were no bodies, then only darker possibilities remained. Malthus, the inquisitorial agent, stepped forward silently, his black rosette glinting beneath the ashlight. He issued no commands, no reassurances, only a slow, measured gaze that passed over Vaughn like a blade assessing where to cut. As squads fanned out through the starport, the weight of absence pressed harder. Tools lay where they had been dropped mid-task. A half-loaded cargo lifter sat frozen on its rails. A meal tray, still containing neatly rationed servings of nutrient paste, remained undisturbed on a worker's bench. It was as if the world's inhabitants had been plucked away in an instant, leaving behind only the echo of their labor. A Vox log crackled suddenly from a nearby console, startling everyone. The voice was faint, warped by static, but unmistakably human. "Do not follow the signal. Repeat, do not." The message cut off abruptly with a sound like tearing cloth, replaced by a low, humming resonance that made the teeth ache. The Mechanicus adepts exchanged hurried Binharic chatter, their mechadendrites twitching like startled insects. Vaughn ordered a secure perimeter established, but unease gnawed at him. The ash underfoot was unnaturally uniform, as though sifted by some colossal sieve. Then, as he paced the edge of the landing zone, he saw it, a perfect circle carved into the ash plain, 50 meters across. The rim was sharp and unbroken, the interior completely smooth, without a single footprint crossing its surface. Kneeling beside it, Vaughn extended a gloved hand, and felt the faint warmth emanating from the ash within. "Captain," he said, his voice low, Tell me what could make a mark like this. Juros stared, his face pale beneath the rebreather mask. Nothing natural, Commissar. No blast pattern matches this. It's deliberate. Before Vaughn could respond, the humming from the Vox log deepened, spreading across every active channel. The same phrase that had haunted their journey here surged forth, louder now as if spoken by 1,000 distant voices whispering in perfect unison. The throne sleep. All around them, the ash began to tremble, swirling inward toward the circle's center as if drawn by unseen breath. Soldiers raised their weapons, shouting over the noise, but there was nothing to shoot at, only the inexorable pull of that perfect shape. Vaughn's heart pounded as he realized, with cold certainty, that whatever had happened on Varelia Ike was not over. It was only just beginning. The air within the starport grew heavier as the humming faded, leaving behind a ringing silence that felt almost Commissar. Vaughn's breathing rasped in his helm's filter as he scanned the circle once more, watching the last tremors of ash settle into stillness. His instincts screamed at him to order a withdrawal, to get his regiment back aboard the sanctity of resolve and put this cursed world behind. But he knew retreat was impossible. There was no clear enemy, no battle fought, no report to file that would not see his name struck from records and his body purged by a bolt round for cowardice. The Emperor's justice allowed no space for hesitation. Interrogator Malthus stood at the circle's edge, motionless. His posture was as rigid as a statue, his head slightly tilted, as though listening to something only he could hear. Vaughn moved toward him cautiously, lowering his voice. Inquisitor, do you know what this is? Malthus did not look at him. Not yet, he replied softly, his words almost lost beneath the faint static still whispering over the Vox. But it is old, older than this colony, older than even the Imperium's claim to this sect. His gaze slid sideways, meeting Vaughn's eyes with sudden unsettling clarity. We must go deeper. The surface lies. It always lies. Vaughn's unease deepened. He had served with many agents of the Holy Ordos, and all were dangerous men. But Malthus carried an edge unlike any other. His voice lacked the theatrical weight most inquisitors wielded. There was no overt threat, only cold certainty, and that was far more terrifying. The guard regiment split into squads and began a sweep of the immediate area. Vaughn monitored their progress through helmet Vox, each report a heartbeat in the growing quiet. Auspec's readings came back erratic. One moment the instruments detected no life signs at all. The next they flared with false positives. Readings of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of biosignatures moving just out of visual range. Sergeant Helbrandt's voice crackled over the link, strained. Command, this is Delta T. Auspex shows, Emperor's Mercy. It shows us. It's mirroring our own readings back, but inverted. I don't. The transmission dissolved into static before returning a second later. Copy Delta Team moving to Quadrant 4. Vaughn's brow furrowed. He replayed the Vox log automatically and realized something chilling. The second message was not identical to the first. The cadence was wrong, the phrasing slightly altered, as though someone or something had copied the sergeant's voice and attempted to speak with it. Further confusion spread as more squads reported similar anomalies. Soldiers swore they caught glimpses of figures at the edges of their vision, men in Imperial uniforms, bearing their regiment's own insignia, yet always just far enough away to avoid identification. Captain Juros ordered a tighter formation, but the very layout of the starport seemed to resist containment. Streets looped back on themselves. Doorways that had been open minutes before now stood sealed. Even the ash patterns shifted subtly between passes, as though rearranging behind their back. A mechanicus, adept, named Zytherus, knelt by a conduit junction, his mechadendrites burrowing into the metal. Interference pattern confirmed, he reported in a droning monotone. Vox signals are cycling through frequencies at non-standard intervals. Resulting distortion resembles respiration. His augmetic eyes flickered as he passed the data. These readings imply the environment itself is breathing. Vaughn stared at him. Breathing? Are you telling me this place is alive? The adept clicked once in binary before answering. Incorrect. Biological model. It does not live. It persists. The phrase chilled Vaughn more than any declaration of life could have. The regiment pressed on, morale thinning like stretched wire. Men muttered half prayers, half curses, gripping their last guns, until knuckles went white. Then, without warning, a sharp guttural cry rang out over the comms. Squad Theta's feed erupted in a cacophony of shouts and weapons discharges. Vaughn sprinted toward their location with Juros and a cluster of soldiers in tow, the ash churning beneath their boots. When they arrived, Theta squad stood clustered around a single trooper writhing on the ground. The man's eyes rolled back, white and sightless, his mouth working as if caught between prayer and scream. His voice poured out in a rapid torrent of words, many in High Gothic, others in languages none present recognized. At first it seemed like incoherent rambling, then Vaughn realized with a jolt that the words were fragments of liturgy, phrases every Imperial citizen knew, but rearranged, twisted, spoken in reverse. "Hold him!" Juros barked. 2 soldiers pinned the man as he convulsed violently. Blood streamed from his nostrils and ears, staining the ash-dark. Vaughn knelt, straining to catch the final words before the trooper's throat seized. Awake beneath the silent throne, with a ragged gasp, the man went utterly still. His body sagged lifelessly, and the oppressive silence returned with crushing finality. Malthus appeared beside them without sound, his presence like a sudden drop in temperature. "Dispose of the body," he ordered flatly. "No rights, burn it where it lies." Juros hesitated. "But the Emperor's..." "Now," Malthus snapped, his tone brooked no The soldiers obeyed, casting fearful glances at one another as the corpse was consumed by searing promethium flames. Vaughn turned to demand an explanation, but before he could speak, a new sound erupted over every Vox channel at once. It was their own voices, the entire regiment's layered and distorted, each word arriving 3 seconds after it was spoken. The delay was slight but unmistakable, and worse, the echoes did not match perfectly. Tiny differences crept into the repeated phrases, as if the speakers were similar, but not identical. "Command, status report," Juros called. 3 seconds later, the same words came back, but the reply used an older passphrase, one abandoned years ago. All around them, the soldiers froze. The Vox chatter built into a chaotic web of overlapping transmissions, their own voices shouting orders they had never given, reporting casualties that had not yet occurred. Vaughn's hand tightened on his power sword. "Form a perimeter," he commanded, forcing steel into his voice. "Whatever this is, it's testing us. It wants us to break formation." Through the crackling din, a single, uncorrupted signal cut through. A child's voice, clear and fragile, whispering the same phrase they had heard since entering orbit. The throne slid. The words faded, leaving nothing but static, and the racing hearts of terrified men. Vaughn's breath caught as he realized they were no longer alone in this starport. Something was here with them, listening, learning and preparing to answer in ways they would not understand until it was far too late. The ash clung to every surface as the regiment advanced beyond the starport, the swirling gray haze muffling sound and swallowing distance. The only voices came through the Vox network, clipped and cautious, punctuated by the occasional stutter of interference that made every man flinch. Commissar Vaughn led from the front beside Captain Juros, with Malthus gliding silently just behind them, his black cloak trailing like a shadow that did not belong. No one dared speak aloud unless necessary. The echoing distortion of their own voices still haunted them, and each soldier feared giving the unseen enemy more to imitate. Ahead, the outlines of Bitter Hollow emerged from the fog. It was a settlement of functional, blocky habs, arranged around a central processing plant, built without ornament or care. Normally such a town would be alive with the sounds of laborers, the clank of machinery, the distant drone of devotional hymns piped through loud halos. Now there was only the oppressive silence, and the faint hiss of wind moving through abandoned structures. Vaughn raised his hand, signaling the regiment to halt. The men fanned out, weapons raised, scanning windows and alleys. Nothing moved. Vaughn's boots scraped against metal plating as he crossed the threshold into the town proper. The streets were eerily intact. Nothing had been looted or destroyed, yet a strange wrongness pervaded every detail. Tools sat neatly in racks, machines stood idle with their power indicators still glowing faintly, and personal effects were left in perfect order as if their owners had simply walked away mid-thought. A child's toy lay in the dust, its painted surface marred by tiny black burn marks that formed no identifiable pattern. Then Vaughn saw the symbols, or rather the absence of them. Each shrine, each devotional mural, each surface, where the Imperial creed would normally be displayed, had been scrubbed clean with meticulous precision. Even the smallest equilas, etched above doorframes, were reduced to smooth, featureless metal. It was not vandalism. There was no anger or chaos to it. It was as if the very concept of faith had been methodically erased, leaving only blankness behind. Vaughn's throat tightened. To destroy holy imagery was heresy,
but to erase it so completely that it seemed never to have been there was something far worse. Report, he murmured into his vox. Squads began feeding back updates, each one more unsettling than the last. Entire blocks were empty. No trace of life beyond perfectly preserved belongings. Medicae stations remained stocked with untouched supply. Food was still warm on some tables, but spoiled beyond natural decay, as though time itself had faltered mid-meal. Sergeant Hellbrandt's voice trembled over the link. Commissar, we've found clothing, folded, stacked neatly, every piece accounted for, but no bodies, no signs of struggle. Vaughn clenched his jaw, signaling for Malthus to inspect the nearest stack. The interrogator knelt, running gloved fingers over the fabric with an almost reverent slowness. His face was unreadable, but his whisper carried over the comm bead, not removed by force, not These people were rewritten. Before Vaughn could demand clarification, a muffled sound echoed from deeper within the settlement, a single, distant scream that died abruptly. Every soldier froze. Juros gestured sharply, and the regiment surged toward the source, boots thudding softly in unison. The sound had come from a narrow alley lined with storage sheds, but when they reached it, they found only a single uniform lying atop a bed of undisturbed ash. It was arranged perfectly, boots aligned, insignia polished, as if awaiting inspection. "Emperor preserve us," a trooper whispered. Vaughn silenced him with a glare. Fear was spreading like infection, and once it took hold they would be lost. He ordered the squads to sweep outward from the alley, searching every structure. Inside the hab blocks, the horror deepened. The interiors were pristine, untouched by the chaos one would expect from sudden evacuation. Blank walls stared back at them, where once devotional texts would have hung. Even common objects like mugs and tools bore faint marks, as though inscriptions had been carefully sanded away. In one residence, Vaughn discovered a crude doll sitting upright on a bunk. Its stitched mouth was sealed shut with black thread, the knot tied so tightly it had bitten deep into the fabric. He stared at it for a long moment, before placing it back exactly where he had found it. The deeper they went, the more unnatural the environment became. A persistent mist clung to the lower levels of the habs, pooling around their boots even indoors. It muted every sound, turning footfalls and whispered commands into ghostly echoes. The soldiers' breathing became the loudest thing in the world, harsh and ragged through their rebreathers. Even the Auspex scanners struggled, their readings cycling erratically as if they were being jammed by a signal just beyond comprehension. Mechanicus adepts clustered around a central cogitator bank. In the processing plant, their mechadendrites, writhing as they interfaced with the ancient machinery. Vaughn and Malthus stood nearby, watching the data streams flicker across cracked screen. At first, the logs appeared normal, schedules of ore shipments, maintenance records, devotional litanies of machine spirit appeasement. Then, abruptly, every entry ceased at the exact same timestamp 3 weeks prior, at precisely midnight local time. There were no shutdown protocols, no emergency notices, just a hard stop, as if the entire colony had frozen in place at a single instant. One adept emitted a stream of agitated Ben-Herrick clicks, another translated, his mechanical voice grating. "The machine spirits report no termination. Processes are still running, yet there is no activity. This is paradox." Before Vaughn could respond, a panicked shout erupted over the Vox. Squad Gamma had found something in one of the outer Vaughn, Juros, and Malthus rushed to their position, the mist thickening around them like a living thing. When they arrived, they found Gamma clustered around a large chamber, whose floor was coated with a thick layer of ash. In the center of the room lay a series of symbols drawn into the ash with flawless precision. They were geometric, symmetrical, yet entirely alien. The soldiers stood back, visibly shaken. "We didn't make these," one stammered. "Emperor's truth, they were just..." As they stared, a sudden scream tore through the silence, far closer than before. This time it came from just outside the building. The regiment surged toward the doorway, weapons ready, but when they burst into the open, there was nothing, only swirling mist and shifting shadow. Then, a single soldier pointed to the ground. Vaughn followed his gaze, and saw another uniform, perfectly folded, resting atop the ash, exactly where the scream had originated. Vaughn's breath turned to ice in his lungs. There had been no sign of movement, no retreating figure, no tracks leading away. The scream had ended, and in its place was only absence, left behind like a discarded relic. "Regroup," he ordered, his voice cold and commanding to mask the dread curling through his gut. As his men obeyed, he glanced toward Malthus. The interrogator's expression, was one of grim inevitability. Whatever had claimed the people of Bitter Hollow was still here, and now it had turned its attention to them. The silence of the town was not the absence of life, it was the presence of something that thrived on erasure, patient and methodical, waiting to unmake them piece by piece, until nothing remained but folded cloth and blank wall. The mist thickened as the regiment regrouped, swirling through the hollow streets like the breath of some unseen leviathan. Vaughn stood in silence, staring at the perfectly folded uniform lying atop the ash. The fabric was still warm, as if the man who had worn it had been present only moments before. Around them, the town was utterly still. Not a single sound came from the surrounding buildings. No movement in the shadows beyond their perimeter. Only the faint hiss of the wind, muffled by the mist, reminded them that time had not completely stopped. Malthus knelt beside the uniform, examining it with a deliberate clinical calm. No tearing, he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. No sign of struggle. Even the ashes beneath remained undisturbed. His eyes flicked upward, sharp and unblinking. This is no disappearance, this is extraction. The subject has been removed in totality, leaving only the placeholder behind. Vaughn clenched his jaw. That is not possible. Everything here, Malthus replied, gesturing to the blank walls and the folded cloth, exists to teach us the limits of what we think possible. Vaughn's instinct was to argue, but the weight of the town's silence crushed the words before they could leave his throat. The regiment was fraying. Even the most seasoned soldiers shifted uneasily, their lasguns trembling in their hands. Fear was not just spreading, it was embedding itself, a contagion seeded in the mind. If he allowed it to fester, the men would start disappearing like the townsfolk, swallowed whole by the very silence they now feared. We go below, Malthus said suddenly, rising to his full height. His voice cut through the fog like a blade. The surface the truth will be buried where they worked, beneath the rock they opened. Whatever erased them began there. Joros's face darkened. Commissar, with respect, taking the regiment underground now is folly. If this is some Xenos toxin, or... No, Malthus interrupted, his tone sharp. This is not biological, it is structural. Look around you, Captain. The town was never attacked. It was overwritten. The words sent a ripple of unease through the gathered troops. Vaughn raised a hand for silence. We move into the mines, he ordered. Squad by squad, tight formation. No one wanders. No one speaks, unless ordered. If you see something wrong, you report it. You do not investigate it. Understood? The acknowledgement was ragged. Voices strained. As they descended into the main shaft of the Bitter Hollow mine, the air changed. The mist did not follow them. Instead, a heavy, damp heat pressed against their skin, clinging like sweat beneath their armor. The ash gave way to bare stone, and the sound of their boots echoed unnaturally, as though the rock itself were hollow. The tunnels were vast, more like cathedrals carved from the bones of the planet than simple mining corridors. At first, they followed the expected patterns of human construction: support beams, lift platforms, narrow shafts branching into ore veins. But deeper down, the structures shift. The walls smoothed into seamless planes, and the angles grew precise, unnervingly so. The curves and lines felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. Sergeant Hellbrent ran his gauntleted hand along a perfectly straight groove cut into the stone. No mining tool we have could make this, he said, voice hushed. It's like it was grown. Mechanicus adepts crowded around the markings, their mechadendrites twitching with excitement and unease. Zythrus scanned the grooves with his augmetic eye. Material displacement does not match excavation records, he intoned. No tool marks, no residue. This formation is self-arranged. Probability of natural occurrence negligible. The tunnels widened into a spiraling descent that defied reason. There were no ladders, no rails, only a smooth, sloping pathway, winding endlessly downward. The walls glistened faintly as if sweating. Vaughn felt the oppressive weight of the planet above them, yet the air remained oddly breathable, heavy with moisture but lacking the staleness of deep stone. It was as though the tunnels themselves produced the oxygen needed to sustain them. A sound began to echo faintly up the spiral. At first, Vaughn thought it was merely the shifting of stone, but as they descended, the noise resolved into a rhythm, steady, measured, impossibly regular. It was not a natural sound. It was too precise, like the beat of a colossal heart. The men began whispering prayers under their breath, the familiar words anchoring them against the rising terror. Vaughn did not stop them. He too felt the creeping dread of something vast and unknowable moving beneath the surface. The spiral ended abruptly at the threshold of a cavern so large it seemed to swallow light. Their helmet lamps pierced only a fraction of the space, revealing glimpses of immense pillars and strange, angular patterns etched into the floor. At the center of the cavern lay a vast congregation of figures. For a heartbeat, Vaughn thought they had found survivors, kneeling in prayer. Relief surged through him, until he saw their faces. The miners were frozen in perfect unison, their bodies rigid and unbreathing, skin pale, eyes wide open. They knelt facing inward, toward a single structure, a black obelisk that rose from the cavern floor. Its surface drank the light, absorbing it rather than reflecting it. Private Krenz vomited inside his rebreather, gagging and choking as he stumbled backward. The others followed, muttering curses and prayers. Vaughn forced himself forward, crouching beside one of the mine. The flesh was cool but not cold. There was no sign of decay, no odor of death. It was as though time had stopped for them in mid-motion. Emperor's name, Juros whispered. What could do this? Zythrus's mechanical voice rattled through the box. No biological stasis, no chemical agent detected. They are maintained, preserved at the moment of cessation. Vaughn rose slowly, his gaze fixed on the obelisk. What are they looking at? As if in answer, the rhythmic sound deepened. It pulsed through the stone and into their bones, setting teeth on edge. The frozen miners seemed to tremble faintly, though no muscles moved. The obelisk emitted no visible light, yet its presence dominated the cavern, like a silent command. Malthus stepped forward, his voice calm but reverent. They are not worshipping, he said. They are warning. Vaughn turned sharply. Warning of what? The interrogator did not answer. Instead, he knelt beside the obelisk and laid a single hand against its surface. The stone was perfectly smooth, unnaturally so. Vaughn thought he saw a ripple pass through it, like water disturbed by breath. Then the rhythmic sound ceased. The silence that followed was total, suffocating. Before anyone could react, a light flickered across the cavern floor. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it came from beneath the obelisk, seeping outward in thin, precise lines. The light traced symbols across the floor, connecting the kneeling bodies into a single vast pattern. From above, it might have formed a sigil or rune. From where they stood, it looked like the inner workings of some colossal machine. Vaughn's breath caught. The pattern seemed to move, shifting subtly as if adjusting itself around their presence. Then somewhere deep in the darkness beyond the obelisk, something moved, too large to see, too slow to comprehend. The rhythmic sound began again, louder now, no longer merely heard, but felt in the marrow of their bones. Fall back, Vaughn shouted, but his voice was drowned by the rising pulse. And as the soldiers turned to flee, one of the kneeling miners' eyes rolled toward Vaughn, glistening and alive for the briefest impossible moment, before snapping back into their frozen stare. The cavern shook with the renewed pulse, a deep thrumming vibration that seemed to come from every direction at once. Dust and fragments of stone rained down from the ceiling, as the rhythmic sound built to an almost unbearable pitch. Vaughn's ears rang, his helmet's auditory dampeners straining to filter the noise, but still it burrowed into his skull like a living thing. The frozen miners remained perfectly still, locked in their eternal kneel, yet their shadows danced wildly across the cavern walls as if mocking the living soldiers who staggered in terror among them.
Move! Vaughn roared, his voice breaking with the strain. His command cut through the chaos, and squads scrambled toward the tunnel mouth. Their retreat was clumsy, weapons clattering against armor, boots slipping on the damp stone as they fled. Malthus did not move. The interrogator stood before the obelisk, utterly still, his head bowed slightly as if listening. For a moment Vaughn thought he saw the man's lips moving in silent reply to some unheard voice. Then Malthus turned and followed without a word, his expression unreadable in the dim light. When they emerged back into the misted streets of Bitter Hollow, the world felt subtly altered. The silence was no longer passive. It seemed charged now, as though the very air was waiting for something to happen. The men formed a defensive perimeter while the Mechanicus adepts unpacked their sensor arrays, setting up a temporary command point amid the ruined town square. Vaughn paced like a caged animal, his mind replaying what they had seen below. The image of the kneeling miners burned in his thoughts, but worse was the fleeting, impossible glance, that single eye rolling toward him. Alive, it gnawed at his reason. Were they truly frozen, or merely pretending stillness until the proper moment to strike? Atherus interrupted his thoughts with a Benharic burst before translating into low Gothic, analysis of subterranean structure incomplete. Initial scans indicate the obelisk predates colony by no less than 20 millennia. Geological layers disrupted. Warp resonance detected in multiple overlapping strata. Vaughn frowned. Warp resonance. This far beneath the surface. Affirmative. Atherus replied. Signatures are layered, like sediment. His vocalizer clicked. An artificial approximation of each. Deeper layer is older. Oldest reading precedes recorded human expansion into this sector. Malthus crouched over a slate covered in picked captures from the cavern. He traced a gloved finger along the patterns that had glowed beneath the miner. This is no simple device, he said quietly. It is a lattice of intention, a message perhaps, or a lock. He glanced at Vaughn. The miners are part of it now, woven into its design. Their positions form a signal only visible from above. Vaughn stared at him. A signal to who? Malthus's eyes gleamed in the low light. That is what we must learn before it finishes sending. Before Vaughn could reply, a sharp scream cut through the fog. The soldiers spun, weapons raised, but the sound was unlike any they had heard before. It was high and inhuman, echoing not only through the air but through the Vox channels as well, layered into their headsets. Squad Theta reported movement near the perimeter, and Vaughn sprinted toward the disturbance. What he found stopped him cold. In the center of the street, etched into the ash with impossible precision, was a new symbol. It hadn't been there moments before. It resembled the patterns from the cavern floor, its lines perfect and unbroken, curving in ways that hurt the eyes to follow. The ash around the symbol was undisturbed, as if it had settled naturally into this shape rather than being drawn by hand. One of the younger soldiers began to sob quietly. It's growing, he stammered, like it's spreading up here now. Malthus knelt by the design, studying it intently. Not spreading, he corrected, repeating, echoing what lies beneath. The surface is becoming a mirror of the depth. Before Vaughn could order a defensive formation, a loud mechanical scream erupted from the Mechanicus array behind them. The sensors flared red, readings spiking beyond safe limit. Atherus shouted in rapid Binharic, his mechadendrites whipping frantically as he tried to stabilize the equipment. Explain, Vaughn barked. The pulse from below has intensified. The adept translated between bursts of code. It is no longer passive, it is scanned. As he spoke, the symbol in the ash began to glow faintly, emitting a pale, cold light. The soldiers stumbled back, shielding their eyes. A soft rhythmic chant rose on the air, distant at first, then building with horrifying clarity. Vaughn realized with sickening dread that the chant was coming from the frozen miners below, echoing through the tunnels and into the town above. The words were indistinct, fragments of liturgies twisted into unfamiliar shapes, but the cadence was unmistakable, worship and warning combined. Then the symbol flared brightly and a single Mechanicus adept vanished with a sharp crack of displaced air. His tools clattered to the ground where he had stood. No blood, no scream, just absence. Panic erupted. Soldiers opened fire on the glowing symbol, but the ash absorbed their shots without resistance, the light undisturbed. Malthus strode into the chaos, his voice cold and commanding. Hold your fire. It is not an enemy to be destroyed. It is an interface. It has chosen. Vaughn seized Malthus by the shoulder. Chosen for what? The interrogator's gaze was distant, his voice almost reverent. To join the pattern. The rhythmic chant reached a crescendo, shaking the very ground beneath them. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the glow faded, leaving only the perfect, untouched symbol, and the tools of the missing adept. For a long moment, no one moved. The soldiers stood rigid, their breath loud in their helmets. Then the wind returned, carrying the faint hiss of ash across the town square. Vaughn turned to his men, his voice low but steady. This thing is not just beneath us anymore. It's here, with us, watching, and it is learning. Malthus's head tilted, his expression unreadable. Not watching, he said softly. Right. As Vaughn tried to comprehend the meaning of that single word, another symbol began to take shape in the ash only a few meters away, forming itself grain by grain as though an invisible hand traced lines across the surface. The message was clear. They were no longer observers. They were part of the design, and the design was far from finished. The cavern shook with the renewed pulse, a deep thrumming vibration that seemed to come from every direction at once. Dust and fragments of stone rained down from the ceiling as the rhythmic sound built to an almost unbearable pitch. Vaughn's ears rang, his helmet's auditory dampeners straining to filter the noise, but still it burrowed into his skull like a living thing. The frozen miners remained perfectly still, locked in their eternal kneel, yet their shadows danced wildly across the cavern walls as if mocking the living soldiers who staggered in terror among them. "Move!" Vaughn roared, his voice breaking with the His command cut through the chaos, and squads scrambled toward the tunnel mouth. Their retreat was clumsy, weapons clattering against armor, boots slipping on the damp stone as they fled. Malthus did not move. The interrogator stood before the obelisk, utterly still, his head bowed slightly as if listening. For a moment Vaughn thought he saw the man's lips moving in silent reply to some unheard voice. Then Malthus turned and followed without a word, his expression unreadable in the dim light. When they emerged back into the misted streets of Bitter Hollow, the world felt subtly altered. The silence was no longer passive, it seemed charged now, as though the very air was waiting for something to happen. The men formed a defensive perimeter, while the Mechanicus adepts unpacked their sensor arrays, setting up a temporary command point amid the ruined town square. Vaughn paced like a caged animal, his mind replaying what they had seen below. The image of the kneeling miners burned in his thoughts, but worse was the fleeting impossible glance, that single eye rolling toward him, alive. It gnawed at his reason. Were they truly frozen, or merely pretending stillness until the proper moment to strike? Atherus interrupted his thoughts with a binharic burst before translating into low Gothic. Analysis of subterranean structure, incomplete. Initial scans indicate the obelisk predates colony by no less than 20 millennia. Geological layers disrupted. Warp resonance detected in multiple overlapping strata. Vaughn frowned. Warp resonance, this far beneath the surface? Affirmative, Atherus replied. Signatures are layered, like sediment. His vocalizer clicked, an artificial approximation of unease. Each deeper layer is older. Oldest reading precedes recorded human expansion into this sector. Malthus crouched over a slate covered in picture captures from the cavern. He traced a gloved finger along the patterns that had glowed beneath the miner. "This is no simple device," he said quietly. "It is a lattice of intention, a message perhaps, or a lock." He glanced at Vaughn. "The miners are part of it now, woven into its design. Their positions form a signal only visible from above." Vaughn stared at him. "A signal to..." Malthus's eyes gleamed in the low light. "That is what we must learn, before it finishes sending." Before Vaughn could reply, a sharp scream cut through the fog. The soldiers spun, weapons raised, but the sound was unlike any they had heard before. It was high and inhuman, echoing not only through the air, but through the Vox channels as well, layered into their headsets. Squad Theta reported movement near the perimeter, and Vaughn sprinted toward the disturbance. What he found stopped him cold. In the center of the street, etched into the ash with impossible precision, was a new symbol. It hadn't been there moments before. It resembled the patterns from the cavern floor, its lines perfect and unbroken, curving in ways that hurt the eyes to follow. The ash around the symbol was undisturbed, as if it had settled naturally into this shape rather than being drawn by hand. One of the younger soldiers began to sob quietly. It's growing," he stammered, "like it's spreading up here now." Malthus knelt by the design, studying it intently. "Not spreading," he corrected, repeating, echoing what lies beneath. "The surface is becoming a mirror of the depth." Before Vaughn could order a defensive formation, a loud mechanical scream erupted from the Mechanicus array behind them. The sensors flared red, readings spiking beyond safe limit. Atherus shouted in rapid binharic, his mechadendrites whipping frantically as he tried to stabilize the equipment. "Explain," Vaughn barked. "The pulse from below has intensified." The adept translated between bursts of code. "It is no longer passive. It is scan." As he spoke, the symbol in the ash began to glow faintly, emitting a pale, cold light. The soldiers stumbled back, shielding their eyes. A soft rhythmic chant rose on the air, distant at first, then building with horrifying clarity. Vaughn realized with sickening dread that the chant was coming from the frozen miners below, echoing through the tunnels and into the town above. The words were indistinct, fragments of liturgies twisted into unfamiliar shapes, but the cadence was unmistakable. Worship and warning combined. Then the symbol flared brightly and a single Mechanicus adept vanished with a sharp crack of displaced air. His tools clattered to the ground where he had stood. No blood, no scream, just absence. Panic erupted. Soldiers opened fire on the glowing symbol, but the ash absorbed their shots without resistance. The light undisturbed, Malthus strode into the chaos, his voice cold and commanding. "Hold your fire. It is not an enemy to be destroyed. It is an interface. It has chosen." Vaughn seized Malthus by the shoulder. "Chosen for what?" The interrogator's gaze was distant, his voice almost reverent. "To join the pattern." The rhythmic chant reached a crescendo,
shaking the very ground beneath them. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The glow faded, leaving only the perfect, untouched symbol, and the tools of the missing adept. For a long moment, no one moved. The soldiers stood rigid, their breath loud in their helmets. Then the wind returned, carrying the faint hiss of ash across the town square. Vaughn turned to his men, his voice low but steady. This thing is not just beneath us anymore. It's here, with us, watching, and it is learning. Malthus's head tilted, his expression unreadable. Not watching, he said softly. Right. As Vaughn tried to comprehend the meaning of that single word, another symbol began to take shape in the ash only a few meters away, forming itself grain by grain as though an invisible hand traced lines across the surface. The message was clear. They were no longer observers. They were part of the design, and the design was far from finished. Ash rained softly over the regiment as they stared into the newly formed crater, its perfect circle glowing faintly in the darkness. Where the starport had stood, there was now only emptiness, smooth and seamless as though nothing had ever existed there. Vaughn felt the temperature drop, a deep chill settling into his bones despite the thick layers of his coat and flak armor. The world was rewriting itself before his eyes, stripping away every trace of their arrival. The landing craft, the supplies, even the spent shell casings from their firefight were gone. Only their memories remained to prove they had ever landed here. The signal isn't just spreading, Malthus said, his voice low and calm amidst the rising panic of the troops. It is consuming. The surface is being folded inward. There will be no escape, no trace. Joros swore violently and turned on Vaughn. We can't fight this. Commissar, we need to get the men off-world now. There is nowhere to go. Vaughn snapped, gesturing to the crater. Look around you, Captain. Even the Emperor's light can't reach this place anymore. His voice softened, though the edge of command never left. If we abandon discipline, we die faster. We move forward, not back. The only path left was downward. Bitter hollows, mining tunnels yawned open like a wound beneath the ruined settlement, their entrances marked by strange geometries carved into the stone. Malthus insisted the source of the phenomenon lay deep beneath the surface, where the obelisk had first been found. Though every instinct screamed to flee, Vaughn ordered the regiment to descend, knowing that remaining on the surface would mean slow annihilation by forces they could not fight in the open. The first levels of the mine were silent, except for the hiss of respirators and the occasional creak of shifting rock. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The tunnels began to curve in ways that defied natural formation, spiraling endlessly downward with no clear pattern. The walls glistened as though wet, though there was no moisture to be found. As the spiral deepened, the men began to feel the effects. Private Krenz stumbled, clutching his head. I heard something, he whispered. Voices, chanting, like they're inside my skull. Others murmured similar complaints. Vaughn ordered silence, but the men's eyes were wide and glassy, their hands trembling on their weapons. The environmental readings grew erratic. Temperature spiked without warning, searing heat followed by bone-numbing cold. The Auspex devices flickered, displaying contradictory data. Oxygen levels normal one moment, non-existent the next. Sergeant Helbrandt slammed his scanner against the wall in frustration. These readings are garbage. It's like the tunnels are changing around us. Zytherus confirmed this with a series of rapid binaric clicks. Structural layout, inconsistent with initial maps. Probability of physical shift, 98.3%. The tunnels are reconfiguring themselves. The spiral tightened as they descended, twisting back on itself in ways that made no geometric sense. Several times they passed junctions that appeared identical to ones they had already cleared, yet subtle differences, a missing sign, a misaligned support beam, revealed that these were not the same places at all. The men whispered of being followed by their own footprints. Vaughn crushed such talk immediately, though he too had begun to feel the creeping disorientation. Then came the hallucinations. At first, they were fleeting, shadows moving at the edge of sight, whispers in familiar voices. A trooper gasped and raised his lasgun, shouting his dead brother's name before firing into an empty corridor. The bolt ricocheted harmlessly off the stone. Vaughn struck the man across the faceplate, forcing him back to his senses. You will hold the line, soldier, he barked. Whatever you see, it is a lie. But even Vaughn was not immune. As they descended further, he glimpsed images in the shifting walls, memories of campaigns long past, victories turned to defeats, faces of men he had condemned to death for cowardice. The visions were so vivid, he could smell the burnt metal and hear the screams. Only by sheer will did he keep moving forward, one hand gripping the hilt of his power sword as an anchor to reality. The rhythmic pulse that had haunted them above ground now grew louder, resonating through the stone, like the slow beating of a colossal heart. It did not merely echo in their ears, but thrummed inside their bones, rattling teeth and blurring at intervals the pulse would stutter, and in that silence came the faint, unmistakable sound of chanting. The words were still indistinct, but the cadence was horrifyingly familiar. Imperial prayers twisted into something alien. At one point, a recording device carried by a Mechanicus adept began playing back audio before anyone had spoken. It captured their footsteps and breaths seconds before they actually happened. When the adept reviewed the playback, his mechadendrites spasmed wildly, and he emitted a binary scream before collapsing, smoke rising from his augmetics. "Time is breaking," Malthus said coldly, as they carried the body aside. "Cause and effect are no longer reliable here." The men's fear teetered on the edge of open panic. Vaughn knew if he lost them now, they would be slaughtered by their own imaginations before the enemy even revealed itself. He forced them into tighter formation, every squad within arm's reach of the others. "Eyes forward," he commanded. "You see something strange, you report it. You do not act, unless I order it. The Emperor's will is our shield." After what felt like hours of endless descent, the spiral opened suddenly into a massive chamber. The transition was so abrupt that several men stumbled and nearly fell into the void ahead. The chamber was vast, its far walls hidden by darkness. The only visible feature was a colossal stone door set into the floor itself, its surface covered in interlocking symbols, similar to those etched into the ash above. The rhythmic pulse stopped. In the sudden silence, the door began to move, grinding slowly open of its own accord. No mechanism was visible, no machinery to explain its motion. The symbols on its surface glowed faintly as the gap widened, revealing only pure blackness beneath. The soldiers raised their weapons, breaths ragged and loud in their helmet. Vaughn's hand went to his power sword, the familiar hum of its energy field grounding him against the rising tide of terror. Malthus stepped forward, his voice carrying unnaturally in the still air. "We have reached the threshold," he said. "Beyond this point, there will be no more lie, only the truth that has been buried here for longer than our species has walked the stars." Vaughn wanted to demand what truth he spoke of, but before he could, a cold wind surged from the open doorway, extinguishing every light but their helmet lamp. The blackness below seemed to drink the beams, swallowing them whole. Then from that abyss came a whisper, not loud, not even clear, but unmistakably human. It spoke Vaughn's name. The regiment froze as one. The whisper came again, stronger this time, and Vaughn realized with dawning horror that it was not one voice at all. It was many voices, all speaking his name in perfect unison. Behind them, the spiral tunnel sealed shut with a sound like stone grinding against bone. There would be no turning back. The whispering of his name dissolved into 1,000 echoes, blending into a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the marrow of Vaughn's bones. The blackness beneath the great stone door was not absence, but depth, vast and endless, like gazing into the heart of a starless void. The regiment held their positions, weapons raised, though their hands shook and their breaths came fast and shallow. Even the most seasoned veterans looked like frightened recruits. Vaughn forced his breathing to steady, knowing that if he faltered now the entire line would break. "Advance," he ordered, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "Squads 1 and 2 forward, maintain cohesion, no one lags behind." The first steps into the abyss were disorienting. The floor beneath them was perfectly smooth and featureless, yet their boots made no sound upon it, as if sound itself had been erased. The walls sloped outward, revealing a vast subterranean chamber that stretched beyond the limits of their helmet lamp. Slowly, as they descended further, the darkness gave way to a dim cold light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. Then the shapes emerged, rows upon rows of towering shelves, carved directly into the stone, each one stacked with ancient bone tablets. The tablets were covered in countless names, etched in scripts both familiar and alien. Some were high Gothic, others low, and still others in languages no man present had ever seen. The sheer scale of it was staggering. The shelves stretched upward into the darkness, disappearing from view and outward in every direction, until the regiment seemed like insects crawling through a cathedral built for titans. "What in the Emperor's name is this place?" Joros breathed, his voice cracked. "A record," Malthus said quietly, stepping forward. "A ledger of existence." His eyes gleamed as he traced a gloved finger over one of the tablets. "Every name ever written, every life ever lived, or perhaps every life that could be." The words chilled Vaughn more than the darkness around them. "Could be?" Malthus's head tilted slightly. "Possibilities." histories unchosen, futures unrealized. This is where they are stored, preserved until needed. He turned slowly, surveying the endless shelf, and now, it is where they are unmade. As if to punctuate his words, one of the soldiers let out a sudden sharp cry. The regiment spun, weapons snapping up, only to find a gap where the man had been standing a heartbeat early. In his place lay his lascum and armor plates, perfectly arranged on the smooth floor. There was no sign of violence, no blood, no disturbance of dust. He had simply ceased to be. The remaining soldiers stumbled back in horror, voices rising in panicked shout. Vaughn roared them into silence, his own heart pounding. Hold your formation. This is no different than before. Stay together. But he could see the fear in their eyes. Even discipline had limits when faced with something that could pluck a man from reality like a thread from a tapestry. Helbrandt's voice broke over the command channel, ragged with terror. Commissar, look. He pointed to a nearby tablet. The etched letters glowed faintly, rearranging themselves before their eyes. At first it seemed random, but as the light settled, the name that emerged was unmistakable. The vanished soldier's name, followed by a date that matched the very moment of his disappearance. Vaughn's breath caught. Dozens of other tablets began to shimmer, shifting and rearranged. Names appeared and vanished, some familiar, others alien. The soldiers surged forward, scanning the shelves frantically. Then a scream tore through the chamber as one trooper stumbled back, shaking his head violently. No, 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 this isn't right. Vaughn grabbed him by the shoulders. Damn you. The trooper's voice was hysterical. My name, it's here, sir. I'm listed right here. His trembling hand pointed to a tablet etched with precise, glowing script. The date, Emperor save me. The date is today. Panic spread like fire. Men began shouting, scattering between the shelves as they searched for their own names. Some found nothing and fell to their knees in relief. Others screamed as they read their fates etched in cold stone. One soldier in a frenzy raised his rifle and fired into the shelves, but the bolt struck the tablet harmlessly. The name remained, unbroken, as if mocking his defiance. Malthus moved among them like a shadow, his voice calm and eerily soothing. Do not fear the wreck. Fear only what it foretells. He stopped before a massive tablet set apart from the others, its surface cracked and darkened. His gloved hand hovered above it. This one, he murmured. These are not lives lived, these are lives yet to be erased. Vaughn forced the men back into some semblance of order, though it was tenuous at best. He turned to Malthus, his voice a snarl. What purpose does this serve? Who built this vault? What are we fighting? Malthus's expression was unreadable. This is not a weapon, he said. It is a mechanism, a system designed to maintain balance by removing certain threads before they tangle. When a world strays too far, when knowledge grows dangerous, the pattern corrects itself. By killing everyone, Joros spat, his face pale and drawn. Not killing, Malthus corrected, his tone almost reverent, erasing, as if they were never here at all. The words settled like ice in Vaughn's stomach. He looked around the chamber, at the countless names etched into bone. If this place was what Malthus claimed, then the people of Bitter Hollow hadn't died. They had been rewritten out of existence entirely. A flicker of movement drew Vaughn's attention. Across the chamber, more tablets were glowing, the light racing outward like fire consuming dry paper. At the farthest shelf, the glow formed into names he recognized. His own men, their ranks, birth worlds and unit designations appeared in stark, unyielding lines, and at the end of each name was a single date. Today, Emperor preserve us, Helbrandt whispered, falling to his knee. We're already gone. No, Vaughn growled, though fear clawed at his throat. We are still here, still breathing. That means we can fight this. Even as he spoke, the floor beneath them trembled. From the center of the chamber, a low hum began to rise, the same deep vibration they had heard beneath the surface, but now more focused, more deliberate. The shelves shook, dust falling like snow from their ancient. Then, with a slow, inevitable motion, a black shape emerged from the darkness at the chamber's heart. It rose silently, impossibly smooth and featureless, until it loomed above them, like a monolith of night-given form. Malthus's face was pale, his voice barely audible. The obelisk, he whispered. It followed us. Vaughn's hand went to his power sword, the blade hissing to life, but even as he raised it, he knew steel meant nothing here. The obelisk's surface rippled, and for the briefest instant, Vaughn saw his own reflection in it, and behind him, a regiment of men who were not his own, faces twisted in silent screams. frozen forever in a moment that had never truly been. The hum became a voice, a single resonant tone that filled the vault. The shelves blazed with light, and hundreds of names began to vanish all at once, erased from the record before their eyes. And then the chanting returned, louder now, echoing from every corner of the vault, as if the voices of those already forgotten were celebrating the regiment's final moments. The vault shook as the chant rose to a deafening crescendo, a tidal wave of sound that seemed to pour from the very wall. It was not mere noise but language, vast and incomprehensible, words that were felt rather than heard. The glow of the countless bone tablets intensified, each name etched there igniting in pale fire before winking out, one by one, like stars being swallowed by a growing voice. Soldiers staggered, clutching their helmets and ears, their screams lost beneath the overwhelming harmony. Vaughn stumbled forward, his boots slipping on the polished stone floor. His mind reeled, drowning in the voices. They were layered atop one another, thousands upon thousands of voices speaking as one, yet within the chaos he could almost discern individual tone. He thought he recognized his own men's cries mingled with those of Bitter Hollow's lost populace, and beneath them all, a deeper, alien resonance that was not human at all. The choir, Malthus breathed, his eyes wide and unblinking as he stared at the rising obelisk. They have begun to sing.
The regiment opened fire in desperation, the cavern erupting with flashes of last fire and the thudding roar of heavy bolters. Bright streams of energy lanced toward the black monolith, but the beams simply vanished against its surface without impact or sound. It was as though the weapons were being erased mid-flight, their existence denied before they could strike. The men faltered, some dropping their guns entirely as hopelessness swept through the ranks. Then, as if in response to the assault, the kneeling miners from the cavern above appeared, not living bodies, not even corpses, but spectral after-images of flesh and bone, faintly luminous in the cold, sourceless light. They rose slowly from the floor, their movements perfectly synchronized, their mouths opened, and the chant redoubled in volume. No air passed through their throats, no breath stirred their lips, yet the sound emanated from them in flawless unison. Jaros backed away, his face pale behind his visor. "Emperor, help us," he whispered. They're not dead." Malthus corrected him with terrible calm. "Not dead, not alive. They are the choir. Voices unmoored from flesh, preserved to serve the pattern." As the spectral miners advanced, Vaughn shouted for his men to regroup, form ranks, bayonets fixed, hold the line. His voice was raw, desperate. The troops obeyed, but fear was a palpable thing now, suffocating and thick. One of the spectral miners drifted close to a trooper on the flank. The soldier swung his rifle butt through it, but the weapon passed harmlessly through the apparition. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the soldier froze mid-motion, his body locking rigid, his mouth opened, and the alien chant poured from his throat, perfectly in time with the choir. His eyes rolled back, and the color drained from his flesh as though it were being leached away. Vaughn's heart sank. "Cut him down," he bellowed. Two men obeyed, blasting the afflicted soldier to ash with point-blank fire. But even as his body fell, his voice continued in the choir. Disembodied and eternal, it rose to join the others, indistinguishable now from the rest. Malthus turned to Vaughn, his expression grim. "You cannot kill what has been rewritten. Their flesh is only a temporary vessel. Once the pattern claims them, they are part of it forever." Vaughn gritted his teeth, struggling to think past the overwhelming chant. The regiment was being unmade before his eyes, their numbers dwindling by the heartbeat, as spectral figures touched them and stole their voices. Each loss added strength to the choir, and the obelisk's hum grew louder with every stolen soul. Cerberus staggered forward, his mechadendrites spasming wildly as he interfaced with a portable data slate. "Signal frequency identifiable," he screeched in binhyrich bursts. "Resonance matches known warp harmonics, but inverted. It is not summoning, it is excising." "Meaning what?" Vaughn demanded. The adept's vocalizer crackled with distortion. "This is not a ritual to bring something forth. It is a ritual to erase, to unmake what exists so only the pattern remains." Even as he spoke, the walls of the vault began to shift. The shelves of tablets trembled, some splitting apart, their fragments dissolving into motes of light that spiraled upward into the void above. Varn realized with horror that the chamber itself was part of the choir's song, its very architecture resonating like a vast instrument. The spectral miners stopped advancing. They stood motionless, mouths open, voices raised in a perfect, unwavering note. The sound changed, becoming a singular, sustained tone that shook the very marrow of Varn's bone. The regiment fell to their knees, many clutching their helmets, blood seeping from their noses and ears. Varn forced himself upright through sheer will, his vision blurred, the world tilting at unnatural angle. In the haze he saw Malthus moving forward toward the obelisk, his arms spread wide, cloak billowing in the strange, sourceless wind. "Interrogator," Varn roared. "Get back." Malthus did not respond. His voice joined the chant, clear and commanding, harmonizing perfectly with the spectral choir. For a moment it seemed he had been claimed by the pattern, but then his words became distinct, rising above the rest, and Varn realized he was speaking in High Goth. "They are not worshippers," Malthus shouted. "They are custodians. They do not kill because death is crude. They erase, they refine, they perfect. This vault is not a tomb, it is a memory engine, and we are within its working." The obelisk pulsed in response, a slow, measured beat like the turning of some vast alien mechanism. As it pulsed, soldiers vanished, not in flashes or screams, but simply gone between one blink and the next, leaving only their names flaring on nearby tablets. Before those two were extinguished, Varn staggered forward, rage overriding fear. "How do we stop it?" he demanded. Malthus turned, his face lit by the glow of the obelisk. "We cannot stop it," he said, his tone almost serene. "We can only decide what it remembers." Before Varn could press him further, the obelisk cracked open with a sound like a world breaking. Inside was not machinery or stone, but a shifting mass of pale light, writhing and flowing like liquid thought. From within it, new forms began to take shape, figures half seen, their features distorted, as though they were being assembled even as they emerged. The chant reached its final crescendo. The spectral miners collapsed, dissolving into the floor like water soaking into sand. Their voices, however, did not fade. They merged into the single resonant tone emanating from the obelisk's heart. The light surged outward, engulfing the chamber in blinding brilliance. Varn shielded his eyes and screamed orders, but no sound left his throat. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Malthus standing before the open obelisk, his silhouette stark and unyielding, as if he were daring the vault itself to erase him. Then came silence, a silence so complete it felt like the world itself had been scrubbed clean, leaving nothing but the echo of a song that had never truly been sung. Varn awoke to darkness and the taste of copper in his mouth. His vision swam, fractured by bright motes of light that pulsed in time with his racing heartbeat. For a long, agonizing moment, he thought he was blind, until the lights resolved into the faint outlines of his helmet's display. His vox bead emitted nothing but static. The oppressive chanting was gone, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like the world had been hollowed out around him. Groaning, he forced himself to rise. The chamber was unrecognizable. The towering shelves of bone tablets had collapsed into ruins, their fragments floating weightlessly in the air as though gravity had lost meaning here. Slabs of stone drifted slowly past one another like ghosts, glowing faintly with the residual light of names now extinguished. In the center of the devastation stood the obelisk, split open along jagged seams. Its inner core pulsed like a wounded heart, light spilling out in irregular, twitching flashes. Around Varn, only a handful of soldiers remained. Some were stirring weakly, others lay still and silent, their bodies intact, but utterly empty. No breath, no presence, as though they were merely hollow shells. Joros knelt beside one of the fallen, shaking the man's shoulder. "He's gone," he rasped, his voice breaking. "Still warm, but gone." Varn clenched his teeth and looked for Malthus. The interrogator stood at the very base of the shattered obelisk, his back to the regiment. His cloak was torn, his posture rigid. For a moment, Varn thought he was dead too, frozen like the miners had been. Then Malthus raised his head and spoke, his voice unnervingly calm. "It has opened its memory," he said. "We stand within a thought too vast for our minds to grasp." The choir was only the overture. Varn stumbled closer, anger rising to smother his fear. "What did you do?" he demanded. "This breach. This wasn't happening until you spoke their tongue." Malthus turned slowly,
his pale face illuminated by the shifting light. If we had remained silent, we would already be gone. The breach was inevitable. All I did was force it to reveal itself. His eyes were wild, fever bright. And now, Commissar, we may finally see what we face. A violent tremor shook the chamber, sending fragments of stone spinning wildly through the air. A Mechanicus adept screamed as a slab slammed into him, crushing his frame with a sickening crack. From within the cracked obelisk, a strange, ululating noise rose. Not a chant, not a voice, but something beyond speech. It bypassed the ears entirely, vibrating inside their skulls, bypassing every defense. Vaughn fell to one knee, clutching his head. The sound was not simply heard, it rewrote thought itself, stripping words from his mind and replacing them with alien patterns he could not comprehend. Through the pain, Vaughn saw the obelisk's core bulge outward like a membrane straining to burst. Dark tendrils of viscous fluid seeped through the cracks, flowing upward against gravity. Where the liquid touched floating debris, the stone dissolved instantly into motes of nothingness. Contain it, Vaughn roared, but his voice was barely audible over the psychic howl. The remaining soldiers opened fire in unison, last fire and bolter rounds streaking toward the core. For an instant, the light faltered, then the tendrils lashed out with impossible speed, striking the soldiers mid-charge. Each man's struck was unmade in totality, one heartbeat present, the next erased, their existence reduced to a flash of distorted afterimage before vanishing completely. The Mechanicus Magos staggered forward, his mechadendrites writhing wildly. No weapon of flesh can harm it, he screeched in a stream of Binharic, his augmetic voice, box warbled into high Gothic. This is a construct, a living archive designed to rewrite the fabric of history itself. Vaughn grabbed him by the shoulder, dragging him back as another tendril smashed into the ground where they had stood, then shut it down. The Magos's remaining optics swiveled toward the obelisk's pulsing core. To interface, I must connect directly. It will not be without cost. Before Vaughn could respond, the Magos tore free and hurled himself forward. His mechadendrites plunged into the shifting light, piercing its surface like needles entering flesh. The chamber filled with a hideous screech, part machine code, part human scream. The Magos convulsed violently, his body dissolving from the inside out as the obelisk absorbed him. Through his mouth, a new voice emerged, cold, inhuman, yet undeniably sentient. You are echoes, it intoned. This sector is flawed. Correction is required. The words reverberated through every wall, through every bone in Vaughn's body. The surviving soldiers fell to their knees, clutching their heads as blood streamed from their eyes and ears. Joros coughed violently, spitting crimson onto the floor, it speaking through him. The voice continued, each syllable like the tolling of some vast cosmic bell. This world has reached unacceptable variance. All record of it shall be excised. All who remember shall be erased. Vaughn staggered forward, rage burning through his fear. We are servants of the Emperor, he shouted. You will not erase us. The light shifted, almost like a living thing turning to regard him. Imperium, it said, tasting the word like a curiosity. An aberrant sequence. You are already gone. The obelisk surged, and the Magos's body split apart into streams of black fluid that lashed across the chamber. Reality itself seemed to ripple where the fluid touched, walls bending and folding like paper. The chamber's vast size collapsed inward and expanded outward simultaneously, defying reason. Malthus stumbled to Vaughn's side, his voice hoarse but determined. Commissar, listen to me. It doesn't merely destroy, it edits. It removes from memory itself. That's why there are no bodies, no ruins, nothing left to mourn. He grabbed Vaughn by the collar. If it finishes this breach, Varelia Arcs will never have existed at all. The obelisk let out another psychic wail, louder than before. Floating shelves shattered, their fragments consumed by spiraling tendrils of liquid darkness. Through the widening fissure in its core, Vaughn saw glimpses of impossible landscapes, cities of glass and bone, titanic machines carving reality into precise, symmetrical grids, entire star systems folding inward like paper effigies. Emperor above, Joros whispered, falling to his knees. It's rewriting the galaxy. Vaughn shook him violently. Stand, Captain. If we fall now, we take every soul we've ever sworn to protect with us. Malthus turned to the remaining soldiers, his voice cutting through the chaos. There is only one path left. We must sever its connection to this world before the rewrite completes. And how do we do that? Vaughn demanded. Malthus's gaze was grim, By becoming part of its memory, a sacrifice willingly given may disrupt its function, force it to close the breach. The words struck Vaughn like a physical blow. He understood immediately what Malthus meant. One of them would have to offer themselves to be erased entirely, to be swallowed by the pattern so violently it fractured under the strain. The obelisk's tendrils lashed outward again, reducing another squad to nothingness. Time was almost gone. "I'll do it," Vaughn said, drawing his power sword. "This is my command. My failure, my life will buy the Emperor's justice." But Malthus shook his head. "No, Commissar. You are the witness. Someone must remember. Even falsely. The burden is mine." Before Vaughn could stop him, Malthus hurled himself toward the obelisk's core. The tendrils froze mid-motion, hesitating as if in shock. Malthus raised his arms and screamed a single word. Not in Gothic, not in any human tongue, but in the same alien cadence the choir had used. The light swallowed him whole, the breach shuddering violently, the chamber convulsed, stone and air warping in on themselves. The voice faltered, its perfect resonance breaking into chaotic, discordant notes. Vaughn screamed for his men to run, but the floor beneath them split apart, a tidal wave of black light erupting upward. As the breach collapsed, Vaughn caught one last glimpse of Malthus's silhouette within the obelisk's core, and then he was gone, erased so completely it was as though he had never lived at all. The void imploded with a deafening silence, leaving only darkness, and the echo of a memory that was already beginning to fade. The world convulsed as the breach folded inward, collapsing upon itself with a soundless implosion that rattled teeth and shattered thought. For a brief, impossible instant, there was no up or down, no inside or outside, only a churning void where reality buckled and twisted like molten metal. Vaughn staggered through the chaos, clutching at the nearest wall for balance, only to find his hand passing through it as though the stone had turned to smoke. His stomach lurched as the floor beneath him rippled, warping like the surface of a black ocean. The surviving soldiers screamed, some firing blindly into the darkness, their shots swallowed by nothingness. Others clutched their heads, their own memories bleeding away mid-center. Vaughn watched in horror as Captain Joros shouted an order that dissolved halfway through, the sound of his voice unraveling until only silence remained. His face went slack, his eyes hollow, and then he simply wasn't there anymore. No flash, no scream, just absence, leaving behind a last pistol and a single dropped dog tag spinning on the warped floor. Vaughn forced himself to keep moving. He would not be erased, not here, not like this. He pushed through the disoriented remnants of his regiment, striking men with the flat of his sword to drive them forward. "Move," he bellowed, his voice ragged but defiant. "The Emperor's light still shines. You will hold the line until your last breath." But even as he shouted, he knew the line was already broken. There were too few of them left, scattered amid a landscape that was no longer stable. The once orderly tunnels twisted into grotesque parodies of themselves, walls breathing like living things, corridors splitting and rejoining in maddening, impossible loops. The rhythmic pulse that had haunted them from the beginning returned, louder than ever. It no longer came from below or above, but from everywhere, a heartbeat that belonged to the planet itself. With each pulse, the environment shifted violently. Heat slammed into them like a furnace blast, only to be replaced an instant later by searing cold that froze the sweat on their skin. Time faltered with every beat. Last fire discharges hung motionless in midair, then snapped forward. Soldiers moved in jerky, unnatural bursts, and the sound of their breathing lagged behind their movements by second. Through it all, Vaughn pushed his way toward the upward tunnels, dragging two half-conscious troopers by their collars. Behind him, Satharus stumbled, his mechadendrites twitching erratically. His Binharic speech was broken and garbled, like a machine stuck between function. Causality breach, terminus collapse, probability zero. His words dissolved into static before his entire frame flickered like a failing hollow projection, and vanished, leaving nothing behind. Vaughn did not slow. Malthus's sacrifice had sealed the breach, but its death throes were tearing the world apart. The black fluid that had once dripped lazily from the obelisk now surged through the collapsing corridors, flowing upward and outward like veins of night. Where it touched stone, the material unraveled into cascading motes of dust that swirled away into nothingness. Where it touched men, they were erased instantly, their screams cut off before they could fully form. Faster, Vaughn roared. He didn't dare look back. The tide of blackness was gaining on them, moving with a relentless, predatory grace. The remaining soldiers ran, stumbling and colliding in their desperation. Every step forward felt like sprinting across the back of a creature that was trying to shrug them off. The passage ahead twisted suddenly, the stone folding in on itself to form a solid wall where a tunnel had been moments before. The men skidded to a halt, panic rising in their voice. Vaughn raised his power sword and slammed it into the obstruction, its crackling edge cutting deep into the living rock. The material screamed as it split, not with sound but with a psychic wail that stabbed directly into their mind. He forced his blade deeper, tearing open a narrow passage, just wide enough for the men to squeeze through. They burst into a larger chamber, one Vaughn dimly recognized from their descent. It was smaller now, its proportions wrong, as if it had been rebuilt hastily by blind hand. The rhythmic pulse was deafening here, each beat sending ripples across the air itself. The black fluid poured through the chamber's cracks like water through a sinking ship, tendrils reaching hungrily for the survivors. Vaughn spun to face the men. "Hold he, buy time while I..." His words faltered as he saw their expressions. Their eyes were distant, unfocused. Several soldiers moved their mouths in unison, whispering fragments of phrases in perfect synchronization. "No," Vaughn breathed. The pattern had infected. It was not merely consuming the world, it was rewriting his men. Even as they stood beside him, with a guttural roar, he swung his sword, cutting down the closest of the afflicted before they could spread the corruption further. The others snapped out of their trance at the sight of blood, terror replacing their blank stares. "Fight it!" Vaughn screamed. "Your lives are yours, claim them." For a moment they rallied. Laskans fired in ragged volleys, striking the advancing black tent. The shots did little, but the defiance steadied their hearts. Vaughn waded into the fray, his blade a beacon of blue light amid the consuming dark. Then the pulse changed. It skipped a beat, just for a fraction of a second, and in that absence a voice emerged. Malthus's voice, soft and distant, like an echo remembered from a dream. "Vaughn," it whispered. "Go." Vaughn froze. He turned, and for the briefest instant, he thought he saw Malthus's silhouette within the swirling blackness, one hand raised as if holding the tide back. Then the image shattered, and the voice was gone. With renewed fury, Vaughn rallied the survivors. They pushed upward, fighting not only the collapsing tunnels, but the crumbling fabric of reality itself. Sections of passageway winked in and out of existence, forcing them to leap blindly into gaps that might close beneath their feet at any moment. At last a faint grey light appeared ahead. The surface. Vaughn forced the men onward, every muscle in his body screaming. Behind them, the black fluid surged like a tidal wave, devouring everything in its path. They emerged into the open air, just as the ground beneath Bitter Hollow gave way entirely. The entire town sank into a vast sinkhole, the mist swirling violently as the earth was consumed. The regiment staggered back, coughing in the acrid air. The ash clouds above them parted for the first time, revealing a sky lit by a pale, sickly sun. For one fleeting heartbeat, it seemed they had escaped. Then Vaughn looked at the survivors, and felt his breath catch. Their armor markings were wrong, unit insignias subtly altered, colors shift. Even their faces seemed unfamiliar, like memories blurred by time. And when he glanced at the horizon, he saw the Imperial Aquila, etched into a distant spire, now bearing 3 wings instead of 2. The world had not been saved, it had merely been rewritten. As realization struck, an Imperial Vox signal cut through the static, crisp and commanding. "This is Orbital Command. Identify yourselves immediately. Unauthorized forces will be purged." The voice did not belong to anyone Vaughn recognized, and as the message repeated, the rhythmic pulse began again, faint but growing, echoing from somewhere far below. The air above Bitter Hollow was no longer still. The mist that had cloaked the town since their arrival now churned in violent spirals, driven by currents that seemed to rise not from weather but from the wounded earth itself. Vaughn stood among the ragged survivors, staring at the massive sinkhole that had devoured the settlement. It gaped like an open wound, its depths hidden beneath swirling ash and shadow. The rhythmic pulse that had stalked them through the tunnels was faint now, but it persisted, a mocking heartbeat, deep below, as if reminding them that what they had faced was not gone, merely buried. The Vox signal repeated, cold and precise. "This is Orbital Command. Identify yourselves immediately. Unauthorized forces will be purged." The voice was clipped, almost mechanical in its detachment, and entirely unfamiliar. Vaughn's jaw tightened as he looked over his... Their armor was wrong, subtly, unnervingly wrong. Unit insignias were misshapen, unfamiliar markings, etched where none had been before. Even the colors of their pauldrons seemed slightly off, muted shades that didn't match his memories. When he met their gazes, He felt a hollow disquiet. Their faces were familiar, yet not. It was as though the pattern had rewritten them in some small but fundamental way. "Commissar," one trooper whispered, his voice trembling. "Where are we? It doesn't feel like home." Vaughn didn't answer. He turned his gaze to the horizon, where the shattered silhouette of a once imperial spire rose through the thinning mist. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable, a standard monument to the Emperor's glory, but as the sunlight shifted, Vaughn saw it clearly. The great imperial aquila, emblazoned across its facade, bore 3 wings instead of 2. The sight made his stomach twist. It was a subtle alteration, but it was wrong in a way that screamed at his soul. Joros would have spoken then, offered some explanation or defiance, but Joros was gone. The absence of his voice struck Vaughn like a physical blow. He clenched his fists, knowing that this reality they now stood in was not their own. Malthus's sacrifice had sealed the breach, but the pattern had rewritten what lay above just as it had below. They had emerged into a world similar enough to be mistaken for their own, yet different in ways that could not be undone. The vox hissed again, louder this time, as though whoever was speaking was growing impatient. "Identify yourselves. Last warning before surface purification." Sathrus's surviving subordinate, a lesser adept, whose name Vaughn couldn't recall, staggered forward and activated his own transmitter. His Bamharic chant was shaky, his tones misaligned, as if even his language had been altered by the rewrite. Responding to orbit, "This is ground force unit," he faltered, his voice garbling into static before abruptly cutting out. The reply came instantly. "Ground force, identification does not match current records. You are classified as hostile. Stand down or face extermination." The men erupted in confusion. Some shouted in anger, others in fear. Vaughn's mind raced. If the orbital forces no longer recognized them, then this entire regiment would be declared traitor by default. There would be no parley, no investigation. The Imperium did not tolerate anomaly. Malthus's final words echoed in his mind. "You are the witness. Someone must remember." Even falsely, Vaughn realized now what the interrogator had meant. They carried memories of a reality that no longer existed. Memories that marked them as aberrations in this rewritten world. "Commissar," a trooper stammered, pointing to the sky. Vaughn looked up. High above the ash clouds, pinpricks of light flared in the firmament, the unmistakable glow of orbital weapons platforms, aligning for a surface strike. A low hum built in the air, almost lost beneath the faint, ever-present pulse. Beneath the earth, the execution order had been given. "Prepare for incoming fire," Vaughn barked, his voice cracking through the rising panic. "Scatter and take cover." The men obeyed instinctively, diving behind ruined walls and collapsed machinery. As the first bombardment struck, blinding lances of fire tore into the sinkhole, sending gouts of ash and rock skyward. The ground quaked violently, throwing men from their feet. A second volley followed, striking closer to their position. "This is wrong," one soldier gasped. "They're targeting us like we're the enemy." "We are the enemy," Vaughn snarled, dragging him to his feet. "At least to them." The bombardment intensified, the pattern of impacts strangely familiar. Vaughn froze mid-stride, his ears ringing. The rhythm of the strikes matched the pulse they had heard beneath the surface, each detonation perfectly timed. His mind reeled. The pattern wasn't just beneath the ground, it had spread into the fleet itself. The orbiting forces were not simply following orders, they were part of the song now. "No," Vaughn whispered, realization chilling his blood. The breach didn't close, it expanded. As if to confirm his fear, a new voice entered the voxnet. This one was low and deliberate, carrying an eerie calm that silenced the chaos around them. "This world has been corrected. Remnants of prior sequences will be purged. Compliance is mercy." Vaughn felt the men's morale crumble. He raised his sword high, the crackling blue energy casting stark shadows across the ashen plain. "We do not comply," he roared. "We fight. If this reality will not have us, we carve our truth into its bones." A ragged cheer rose from the survivors, fragile but defiant. They poured their fire upward, last bolts streaking into the sky. Even as more bombardments rained down, the ground beneath their feet split and shuddered, fissures racing outward from the sinkhole like cracks in a breaking mirror. Vaughn's visor display flickered, and for an instant he saw not the battlefield, but 2 overlapping realities. In one his men fought and died beneath the 3-winged aquila. In the other, the bitter hollow he remembered still stood, whole and silent, its people forever kneeling before the black obelisk. The images overlapped, merged and then tore apart, leaving him gasping. He realized then that the pattern was not finished. This false dawn was only a step, a temporary shape in an endless cycle of rewriting. The world they stood on was fragile, already beginning to fray at its edges.
As another orbital strike slammed into the Earth, Vaughn shouted over the roar, "Rally to me. We will hold this ground until the last man, and if we must be forgotten, let the Emperor himself witness our stand." The men surged toward him, forming a final defensive ring. Above them the sky burned with the fire of descending judgment, and below the faint pulse quickened, as if eager to erase them all. The battle for this rewritten world had begun, and Vaughn knew with cold certainty that survival was no longer the goal. Survival meant assimilation. Only defiance could keep their truth alive, even if that defiance ended in absolute erasure. The last thing he heard before the bombardment drowned all sound was the faintest whisper, buried beneath the Vox chaos. It was Malthus's voice, impossibly distant, yet unmistakable. "Remember, the battlefield had become a storm of ash and fire. Orbital bombardment struck with the precision of a predator's strike, each impact driving shockwaves through the already fractured terrain." Vaughn crouched behind the ruins of a collapsed refinery wall, his visor flickering as fragments of shrapnel clanged against his armor. Around him the remnants of his regiment scrambled for cover, their movements desperate and disjointed. Above the chaos, the rhythmic pattern of the strikes remained unnervingly consistent, perfectly timed like the beat of a war drum or a heartbeat. Vaughn's mind screamed to make sense of it. The pattern wasn't random tactical targeting. It was a message, the same sequence they had heard deep beneath the surface. The enemy wasn't merely firing upon them, it was speaking through destruction, each detonation a syllable in an incomprehensible language. The realization turned his stomach. Even the fleet above was no longer acting with human intent. It had been absorbed into the same phenomenon that had claimed Bitter Hollow. The Vox crackled to life with a chilling clarity. A new voice replaced the cold, mechanical one from before, deep and resonant, with a cadence that carried both authority and something profoundly wrong. "Ground force contamination confirmed," it intoned. "Purge protocol initiated. Total surface sterilization to commence. Remnants will not be allowed to propagate variants." The words echoed through every channel, overriding squad frequencies, even personal Vox units. Soldiers clutched at their helmets, some tearing them off in panic. The message was inescapable. It was as if the entire world was whispering the same command: "Erase." One trooper screamed, breaking rank, "They're going to burn us all." He bolted toward the rear lines, only to vanish mid-stride, not struck by a weapon, not cut down by enemy fire, but simply erased, leaving behind a scattering of ash that blew away in the violent wind. The men froze, terror spreading through the ranks like wildfire. "Hold your ground," Vaughn roared, his voice raw. He rose from cover, defying the barrage that rained down around them. "This is not our Emperor's justice. This is the enemy's will wearing his face. Stand and fight." His words cut through the madness, if only barely. The men tightened formation, clinging to their training like drowning men grasping a rope. Joros's absence loomed like a wound, but Vaughn shoved it aside. He needed every ounce of focus now. Malthus had spoken of the breach spreading outward, rewriting the Imperium itself. If that was true, then the orbiting fleet wasn't merely attacking them, it was already part of the pattern, a weapon wielded by an intelligence they could no longer comprehend. A sudden transmission sliced through the din, its tone sickeningly familiar. Vaughn's blood ran cold as he recognized the voice. It was Malthus. "Commissar, Rhein Vaughn," the voice said with perfect clarity, as though the interrogator stood beside him once more. "By authority of the Ordo, you are declared heretic and renegade. You and your regiment have been excised from record. Lay down your arms and embrace correction." The men faltered, their eyes wide with confusion and grief. Some turned to Vaughn in disbelief, others in suspicion. The words of an inquisitor carried weight beyond reason, and here was Malthus, their unseen master, condemning them from above. "That's not him," Vaughn snarled, stepping into their line of sight. "You saw Malthus fall, you saw him erase himself to seal the breach. This voice is not him, it's the pattern, using his shape, his words." But doubt had already seeded itself. A handful of soldiers lowered their weapons, their shoulders sagging. If the Inquisition has turned against us," one stammered, "maybe we really are." "No," Vaughn's roar cut him off. He swung his power sword in a wide arc, its blue edge hissing as it scorched the air. "We are the last true record of what happened here. If we surrender, if we comply, we vanish into its lie. That is the only truth you need to know. The orbital fire shifted, striking close. Entire squads were obliterated in seconds, the ground erupting into geysers of molten stone and pulverized ash. Varn dragged 2 men behind a shattered bulkhead as a shockwave rolled over them. When he lifted his head again, he saw a new formation descending from the sky. Drop pods, their retro thrusters screaming through the air. The pods slammed into the battlefield with brutal precision, their hulls hissing as they opened. From within emerged soldiers clad in unfamiliar armor. At first glance they were Imperial Guard, but their markings were alien. Their weapons were standard-issue las rifles, yet subtly different, as if forged according to a design one step removed from the real. And their faces were eerily blank, their expressions fixed and empty, like mannequins carved from memory. One of Varn's men whispered in horror, "Are they us?" Varn stared at the advancing line and felt bile rise in his throat. The enemy hadn't just replaced the fleet, had begun replacing them. These troops were echoes, rewritten copies meant to overwrite the original. If the real regiment fell, these false soldiers would take their place entirely. The enemy formation halted at the edge of the ruined square. Their leader, taller, bulkier, with an insignia Varn didn't recognize, stepped forward and raised his weapon in a precise, mechanical salute. His voice, when it came, was a perfect imitation of Varn's own. "Commissar Ryan Varn," the copy intoned, "you will stand down. This sequence no longer requires your variance. You will be integrated." The men behind Varn recoiled as if struck. Some shouted in fury, others in terror. The copy's calmness was worse than rage, worse than open hostility. It was inevitability given voice. Varn spat into the ash and leveled his power sword. "If I am variance," he growled, "then I will burn this pattern to its roots." The 2 lines clashed. Las fire cut through the smoke, red bolts streaking like veins of blood in the storm-dark sky. The false soldiers advanced in perfect, machine-like unison, unhesitating even as their comrades fell. Varn's men fought with desperate fury, their irregular movements unpredictable, messy, human. Through the melee, Varn pushed forward, cutting down 3 copies with precise, brutal swings. Each one dissolved into ash the moment his blade struck home, leaving behind no body, no trace, just as the miners had vanished. The sight filled him with cold fury. The orbital voice returned, louder now, layering over the sounds of battle. "Total variance elimination, 27% complete. Purge will continue until no discrepancy remains." Varn realized with dawning horror that the battle itself was being tracked, measured like numbers in a ledger. Each death, each erased soldier was part of a calculation too vast to comprehend. He fought his way to the front line and shouted to his men over the chaos. "We cannot win this fight outright. Our enemy is not flesh. It's the story being written about us. Hold your ground and make it bleed for every line it tries to change." Above them, the bombardment shifted again, now falling in a perfect circle around their position, cutting off any retreat. The pattern was closing, rewriting them into a trap from which there would be no escape. Varn's grip tightened on his sword. If this was to be their end, then they would leave a mark, so deep that even the pattern itself would choke on it. He bared his teeth in a grim smile, raising his weapon high as the next wave advanced. "Then let them come," he growled. "Let the galaxy itself remember this defiance." The sky burned as the purge descended in full, and the battlefield was consumed by fire and shadow. The battlefield was no longer a place, but a wound carved into the world. Ash and smoke churned in choking spirals as orbital fire fell in unbroken waves, each strike perfectly spaced, each impact following the same merciless rhythm. Varn stood at the heart of the storm, his power sword a lone shard of defiance against the encroaching dark. His visor display flickered wildly, the machine spirit failing under the sheer strain of the anomaly. Symbols and readings bled into one another, some familiar, others entirely alien, until even the interface seemed to question its own reality. The false soldiers pressed forward without hesitation. They did not shout, did not falter, did not bleed. Every movement was precise, identical, like pages copied from the same text. When struck down, they dissolved instantly into clouds of fine ash, their absence erasing even the memory of their presence. Varn's men fought like madmen, chaotic and irregular, their very imperfection a kind of resistance. Las fire arced wildly, grenades tore gaping wounds in the advancing lines, and the air filled with the deafening noise of battle. But for every enemy destroyed, 2 more emerged from the smoke, their ranks inexhaustible, The pattern was rewriting reality as quickly as it was challenged. Vaughn could feel it now, like a constant pressure at the edges of his mind, trying to force him into a shape that wasn't his own. It whispered through the thunder of artillery, telling him he was already lost, that his defiance was nothing more than a footnote waiting to be erased. A scream rose behind him. Vaughn spun to see one of his troopers engulfed by a sudden rippling distortion. The man's form fragmented like shattered glass, splitting into dozens of flickering after-images before collapsing into nothing. Where he had stood, a new soldier appeared, identical armor, identical stance, but his face was blank, his eyes cold and empty. The replacement turned immediately and opened fire on the very squad he had once fought beside. Vaughn roared in fury and cut the copy down, his blade cleaving through the thing's midsection. It dissolved into ash before it hit the ground. The sight filled him with a terrible certainty. The pattern wasn't simply erasing them anymore, it was overwriting them directly, replacing truth with lies in real time. The vox flared suddenly, drowning out the sounds of battle. Malthus's voice returned, calm and absolute. Variance at critical threshold. Correction accelerated. All remnants will be integrated. Vaughn's grip tightened on his sword. Lies, he bellowed, his voice breaking. You're not Malthus. You're a shadow wearing his words. The voice ignored him. It began reciting names, not random, but the names of Vaughn's, each one spoken aloud, each followed by a sudden blinding flash on the battlefield. As that soldier vanished, there was no scream, no trace. Even the memory of them seemed to falter in Vaughn's mind, their faces slipping away like water through his fingers. He realized with horror that soon it would speak his name. Commissar, someone shouted. It was Helbrant, his armor scorched, his face streaked with blood. We can't hold. Give the order. Anything. Vaughn's mind raced. Malthus had sacrificed himself to seal the breach before, becoming part of the pattern to disrupt it. Could they do the same now? The thought chilled him, but he saw no other path. They could not win by strength of arms. Their only weapon was choice, the one thing the pattern could not predict. Rally to me, Vaughn shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The remaining soldiers stumbled toward him, their eyes wide with exhaustion and terror. Listen well, if we fall scattered, we will be overwritten piece by piece, until nothing remains. But if we fall together, we may leave a mark it cannot erase. The men nodded, understanding dawning through the haze of fear. They tightened their formation, shoulder to shoulder, even as the false soldiers closed in. The air thrummed with the rising pulse, the beat now so loud it seemed to shake the world itself apart. Vaughn raised his sword high. We are the last memory of what was true, he said, his voice raw with conviction. Let it come. Let it see us. Let it choke on what it cannot rewrite. The ground split open as the final wave descended. An endless tide of false soldiers, orbital fire falling in perfect, synchronized patterns, the sky itself tearing along lines that formed shapes too vast to comprehend. Vaughn and his men charged headlong into the storm, their cries ragged and real, their movements chaotic and defiant. One by one, they fell. Each death was marked by a ripple through the battlefield, a distortion in the air as the pattern struggled to absorb the truth of their resistance. Even as their bodies dissolved, the memory of their stand burned brighter, a stubborn flame that refused to go out. At last, only Vaughn remained. His armor was shattered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The false soldiers encircled him, their blank faces impassive. Above the bombardment ceased. A perfect, unnatural silence descended. The voice spoke again, soft and close, as though whispering directly into his ear. Final variance detected. Prepare for integration. Vaughn laughed, a broken, defiant sound. You will not have me, he spoke. You may erase this world, this battle, even my name, but you will never own my truth. He drove his sword point first into the ground, and bellowed a single word with all the strength left in him. Remember. The blade flared brilliantly, a surge of raw defiance channeled through its machine spirit. The light spread outward, searing through the false soldiers. For an instant, they faltered. The perfect rhythm of the pattern stuttered, then broke entirely. Vaughn felt himself dissolving, his body unraveling into fragments of light and memory. But as he faded, he saw flashes of other realities, worlds untouched by the pattern, timelines where Bitter Hollow still stood, where Malthus lived, where his regiment marched in proud defiance beneath a two-winged aquila. In that final moment, he understood. The pattern could erase flesh and stone, but it could never fully extinguish a will that refused to bow. As the battlefield dissolved into nothingness, the last thing to vanish was the glow of Vaughn's sword, embedded in the ashen earth. And though no voice spoke, though no witness remained, the echo of his final cry lingered for one impossible heartbeat, defying oblivion. Remember,
When Vaughn's final cry faded, the world seemed to hang in suspension. The ashen battlefield, the false soldiers, even the burning sky dissolved into fragments of light that fluttered like embers before being snuffed out by an unseen breath. Then, without warning, the fragments reassembled, and Vaughn found himself standing in a vast chamber that dwarfed anything he had seen beneath Bitter Hollow. It was not stone, nor metal, nor any material he could name. The walls shifted and flowed like liquid memory, their surfaces rippling with images of countless worlds. Some he recognized: proud hive cities, imperial fortresses, sacred cathedrals of the ecclesiarchy, but others were alien, unsettling, their architecture following geometries that hurt his eyes. Each image flickered, in and out of existence, as if reality itself were being edited before him. At the center of the chamber stood a throne. It was immense, carved from a single block of obsidian-like material, its surface etched with intricate, ever-changing symbols that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. The seat was empty. Vaughn staggered forward, his boots leaving no mark on the shifting floor. His armor was gone, replaced by his uniform, though even it seemed subtly altered. The insignia on his breastplate was wrong again, its lines too sharp, its meaning hollow. His power sword was no longer in his hand, yet he felt the weight of it still, as if it lingered in the memory of his grip. "Commissar Rain Vaughn," a voice said, though it came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Vaughn froze. The voice was not Malthus, nor the cold mechanical tones of the fleet. It was vast and layered, containing echoes of countless speakers, some human, some impossibly alien. It spoke his name with perfect precision, stripping it bare of all meaning. "You have resisted integration," the voice continued, each word falling like a hammer blow. "You are variants. This is not permitted." Vaughn forced his trembling legs to move. "I have seen what you do," he said, his voice hoarse. "You erase worlds, rewrite history, until nothing remains but your lies. You think yourselves gods, but you are only thieves of memory." The throne pulsed with cold light. Images flickered across its surface. Vaughn himself, leading his regiment into battle, kneeling at imperial shrines, executing traitors in the emperor's name. Then those images shifted, subtly altered. His regiment wore unfamiliar colors, their banners bore strange sigils, and the executions were of people he did not recognize. "You misunderstand," the voice said. "There are no lies, there is only correction. You do not remember the truth, because you are not meant. We remove what must be removed, so the pattern remains whole." Vaughn clenched his fists. "You call it correction, I call it annihilation." The chamber darkened, the images on the walls faded, leaving only the throne glowing in the center. "Annihilation is wasteful," the voice intoned. "We do not destroy, we overwrite. The old is recycled into the new. Nothing is lost, only improved." Vaughn felt a surge of rage, but beneath it, a creeping dread. Was that not what the Imperium itself did in its own way? Worlds conquered, faith imposed, history rewritten, to suit the Emperor's will. The difference here was scale. This was not a single empire rewriting history, it was the universe itself, cold and mechanical, ensuring that no reality could deviate from the intended shape. "No," he growled, "you will not overwrite me." The throne pulsed again, and a figure appeared seated upon it. At first, Vaughn thought it was human, broad-shouldered, draped in robes of black and gold, but as he stared, the figure's features shifted and blurred. One moment it bore Malthus's face, the next Jeroz's, then his own. Each transformation was seamless, as if the throne were pulling identities from his memories and wearing them like masks. "This is not defiance," the figure said, its voice now a perfect imitation of Vaughn's own. "It is futility. You fight to preserve what was never real." Vaughn staggered back, shaking his head. "I know what's real. I remember my men, my world, the truth you tried to erase." The figure leaned forward, its borrowed face twisting into something almost compassionate. Bitter Hollow has been corrected 1,000 times. In one sequence you were never born, in another you were the one who led its erasure. Every memory you hold is a fragment, a possibility, no more real than the ones we discard." The chamber walls shifted, showing flashes of these alternate realities. Vaughn saw himself in countless forms: a loyal servant of the throne, a heretic, leading rebellion, a nameless soldier dying in the mud. Each version felt authentic, vivid, undeniable. His knees buckled under the weight of it. "No," he whispered. "I am me. I am Roan Vaughn." The throne's voice softened, almost soothing. "You are a variable, a line of code in a greater design. We do not hate you, we only correct you." The figure raised its hand. Behind Vaughn, the walls opened to reveal Bitter Hollow as it now existed, a pristine settlement, bustling with life. The people moved with mechanical precision, their faces blank, but peaceful. There were no ruins, no ash, no trace of the horror beneath. Look, the voice said, is this not better? No suffering, no chaos, no war, only harmony. Vaughn's heart twisted. For a moment he wanted to believe it. The faces of his men flashed before him. Helbrant, Juros, the countless nameless soldiers who had followed him into the dark. If this was peace, if this was survival, perhaps it was worth the cost. Then he remembered the folded uniforms in the empty homes, the perfectly silent miners, frozen in their endless kneel, the false soldiers wearing the visages of his brother. He saw through the illusion, saw it for what it truly was, not harmony, but obliteration disguised as mercy. His voice was steady when he spoke. If I am the last variance, then I will remain so. Better to be a flaw than a false perfection. The throned figure tilted its head, curious. Even if it means the pattern will erase you utterly. Vaughn straightened, defiance burning in his eyes. Let it try. The chamber shuddered violently. The throne's glow flickered, its shifting faces momentarily faltering. A deep, resonant hum filled the air. The same rhythm Vaughn had heard since the beginning, only now he understood. It was not the sound of inevitability. It was a heartbeat, and it could falter. Vaughn lunged forward, seizing the edge of the throne with both hands. The surface burned his flesh, but he did not let go. Images erupted around him, millions of memories colliding, worlds rewritten, lives erased, possibilities collapsing into one another. He felt himself unraveling, his identity pulled apart, like threads of fabric. In the final moment, before the pattern consumed him, he shouted the only word that mattered. Remember. The chamber exploded in light. The throne crumbled, its false figure dissolving into ash. The walls shattered, releasing a tidal wave of stolen memories into the void. And then there was nothing but silence, and the faint echo of a heartbeat, waiting to decide what would come next.